Weber interestingly says that in times of social crisis, what gets pushed into the foreground is class, is this issue of class. And this is also on page 174, but on the right column. He writes, as to the general economic conditions making for the predominance of stratification by status, only the following can be said. When the basis of the acquisition and distribution of goods are relatively stable, stratification by status is favored. And everything is stable. Every technological percussion and economic transformation threatens stratification by status and pushes the class situation into the foreground. Epochs and countries in which the naked class situation is of predominant significance are regularly the periods of technical and economic transformation. And you could argue that this is precisely what we're observing now. We are really starting to have now a huge discussion about the class basis of American society, looking very closely into executive compensation and how Wall Street bankers have been able to manipulate the system based sheer on their economic prowess. So now suddenly we are starting to see that, which for decades was rather invisible. It was actually considered quite something to be a Wall Street banker. Any questions about that?
Yeah, so how do they formulate occupational prestige?
This is based really on, in the end of it all, on surveys. Yeah?
Right.
People are asked, what do you think of a doctor or of a lawyer? Okay? So of course you will have different people, will give different credence, will have a different estimation of what the status of a lawyer is, how much they esteem a doctor. Okay? But you will find significant differences between the esteem in which, say, an academic is held, artists are held, versus a street cleaner. Okay? So then it's like a numerical value that is assigned to different occupations, and it's one of the elements that then counts towards determining your class status.
So by polling people, they kind of get like that?
They get that, but this is very long established. There's actually like a compendium, like a large work, which is even issued, I believe, by the United Nations. Yeah? So international, of course, you have international differences, but it's a large book where you can look up the social esteem of different occupations. So this is not something that is done every time when we try to figure out how the class situation has changed over time. So this is something that is just changes slowly.
And I don't know if it's relevant, but when they formulate the SES, do the three values have equal weight, or is it like I don't know if it's relevant, but
I think this depends also on what the emphasis is that you're looking at, because even income, some sociologists argue that just looking at income as the economic aspect of it isn't enough, that what we really have to look at is wealth. Okay? But it's very difficult to get information on wealth holdings, so income is an approximation. But I think in the general formulations it's giving equal weight. And this is really due to Weber, okay? Because Weber argued there's more to social position than sheer market power, than sheer income.
So
because what interests him, why he's talking about these at all is the question of power. What is it that gives you power in society? And it's not only sheer income that gives you power.
He was really the first to talk about status as opposed to just class?
Yes. Yeah, and all of this formulated as a critique of Marx, like in a dialogue with Marx. He's basically saying to Marx, no, but that's not all there is. And looking at status helps us to explain also certain differences between the US and Europe, for example. Okay? Because it's based on these concepts that Weber is using, we could argue that in Europe, class and status are still much more closely associated. There's hardly a gap between class and status. Whereas in the US and the social order in the US, there's somewhat of a distance here. Which means, for example, that you can start claiming status by being admitted to an elite institution. by starting to move in the right social circles, and over time you can then also, this gives you certain economic opportunities and you can climb in the class order. Or the reverse, the example of the nouveau riche would be, you can start off with, by the luck of the market, by your investments or your ideas, attain economic power, and then through your children, this takes time, you can attain status. So there's somewhat, the connection here is looser. You can start usurping status and through that class position, or the other way around. Yeah? And it seems that in Europe there's less of it's less open, the system. Yeah? So there's a closer connection, which then explains why class is more visible. It simply seems more visible in Europe. People are more regular people, without this not dependent on having any sociology education, but you will find regular people in conversation much more talking about social class. And whereas the awareness in the US is less of the power of social class. So we seem, our system seems to be run much more on the surface by usurping a certain lifestyle, by lifestyle differences. You know, we seem to think that there are differences in society only because people choose to live different lifestyles. So it's less visible that what is underlying, for the most part, because for the most part it is still, in the long run it is still wealth that is the basis for status, in the long run. But there are these exceptional cases, and they are exceptional cases, but this is what our fascination is focused on. This is what the media images are focused on. They're focused on these stories of Bill Gates becoming fabulously rich, or all these people who have one good idea and then become fabulously rich. So it seems it's just a matter of individual ingenuity that allows you to climb the social ladder. So the effects of long-time status and wealth that is always connected to having a long-time family legacy, there's always wealth there, because of the long time, that's what it means. It's less visible here, it's less talked about, less obvious. It becomes obvious only in times of crisis like now.
The lineage is less obvious, you mean?
Yeah, I mean, who talks about the Bush clan actually coming from a long line of very influential, extremely wealthy
in Europe,
individuals?
they talk more about the lineage?
Yes, it's more obvious. Yeah? It also has more direct effects, because if you don't already, and I'm again citing the example of France, because in France, class and status distinctions are probably among the most extreme in Europe. So in France, if you don't already have that long legacy, it will be more difficult for you to get admitted into any of the elite institutions. So that moving from starting to usurping status and then climbing in the social order is more difficult. And the same goes the other way around. Just sheer wealth, it's more difficult to translate that into status over time. So there's less mobility. Yeah? This is all a matter of degree. It's not absolute. Yeah? But we can say that the reason why class, the power of long-time wealth, is less obvious is that there's a little bit a looser connection in the United States.
So in a way, could you almost like define the degree of social mobility in a society as like
the looseness?
Yeah, like how quickly class converts to status or something.
It's a good way of arguing that.
And so Weber would say that in the U.S., class converts to status quicker. Right? Is that right? Or sort of?
Yeah, he was certainly observing that there is more mobility. I mean, he was describing the examples really of the parvenu that he was describing are really drawn from his observations in the U.S. And this is really, I mean, these are the stories that define the myth of the American dream. This is really what defines U.S. culture almost, this belief in that kind of openness. Even though there are exceptional cases, but they seem to attract our attention, and by that they attract our attention away from the true power of class.